Robert, Rachel, thank you both for being here. And we start a new era. Majority politics, trying to remember what it's all like. A new look government, maybe it'll look even newer after Brexit itself. I just wondered, first of all, what has surprised you in the first weeks of this new administration? Rachel?
I'm not sure surprise is exactly the word, but the eye-catching thing was Dominic Cummings' extraordinary memo calling for weirdos and misfits to apply to join Whitehall. And at one level, it's not surprising because he's always been a maverick figure who is contemptuous, really, of the establishment. He's very brilliant and sort of interesting and fascinating to talk to and energetic, but he's always despised the sort of status quo. But for him to sort of actually publish a blog calling for new types of people to apply for civil service jobs, I thought was both fascinating and surprising that he actually went public.
Well, I'm sure we'll come back to that. It's a very good... Robert, your biggest surprise?
I think my surprise has just been on the Labour side, to be honest, which is just how, it still doesn't seem to have sunk in. I'm sort of getting a sort of sense of deja vu because after the 2015 election, I did my...
They come fast these days.
Yeah, I did my piece of snap analysis going, well, so obviously, they lost the election because they were too left-wing. They'll move back to the centre. Chuckaramina, your hour is now, which I think qualifies as some of the worst political analysis this country's ever seen. Because obviously, they reacted sort of psychologically and emotionally rather than cephalogically. And I think we're sort of seeing the same thing. I mean, it looks like Keir Starmer is going to run, but he's running on a sort of platform of, I spent the 80s hating the Tories, on the picket line, I'm not a smooth Liz Linton Metropolitan at all. And the Rebecca Long Bailey 10 out of 10 for Corbyn. Where he just led the party to the most disastrous election result in decades. It was, and on the Tory side, I think everyone is waiting partly for the reshuffle. Everyone is if you have conversations with people, everyone's sort of playing a game of like sort of fantasy Lego with departments, sort of trying to work out what configuration they think it's going to be in. Does it make sense to put this bit there, or that kind of thing. So I think everyone is waiting for that for that sort of. Once Brexit is delivered, then for the next stage of the revolution.
Which may bring us neatly back to Dominic Cummings. I mean, some people would say, and there's always a danger of overplaying the importance of a aide or a chief aide, that the future of this administration will depend on how long Dominic Cummings is there for and how much his influence is felt, how radical the changes are. What do you think is Boris Johnson's, what do you think is the longevity of Dominic Cummings? And will all this stuff that he talks about, like radical reshaping of the way work is done in Whitehall and the rest of it, there are many other headings we can talk about there, will it all come to pass, do you think, Rachel?
Well, I thought it was fascinating. There was a story this week suggesting that Dominic Cummings had embraced Mark Sedwill, the Cabinet Secretary, and they are now on the same page. I thought, classic Sir Humphrey, he's hugged him close. And that's the way of Cabinet Secretary neutralising this radical, really. He's already making, and already there are suggestions that his more radical plans for Whitehall, reshaping, maybe watered down.
We're not going to have a 5-strong war cabinet, which is what he'd like, are
exactly. I think what's interesting is whether he can realise that as well as going to war with people internally, you also have to charm people if you really want to get things done. And I think, Steve Hilton was the previous David Cameron's, barefooted advisor who wandered around in T-shirts, ostentatiously scruffy, a bit like
Dominic Cummings was almost bare-bummed today, this week, wasn't he?
So the number of holes in his jumpers goes up by the day. And it's almost a sort of affectation, I think, that I'm so posh and important, I don't need to dress properly. But Steve Hilton, in a way, had a sort of scattergun effect. It was all blue skies thinking. Dominic Cummings is much more focused. He's got a much clearer idea of how to do things and what he wants to do. But he does have this sort of way of alienating people when you need to win friends and win allies in Whitehall if you're going to get things done in the real world. It's all very well having these great schemes and radical revolutions in theory, But when you're dealing with a bureaucracy, whether it's in Whitehall or Brussels, you do actually have to get the machine to work with you rather than against you. And at the Department for Education, he kind of went to war with the officials with this attack on the blob. And actually, arguably, the most significant changes that he and Gove brought through were the changes that Andrew Adonis and Tony Blair had already started.
The continuity work. They didn't need to badge it as a revolution.
All kinds of rows and supposed revolutions, but actually quite a lot was already going on, left over from Blair.
Well, I mean, I slightly disagree on that. I mean, I think if you look at the Cameron administration, it's Gove and Cummings were the ones who got the most done in any. Arguably, I mean, you can talk about welfare reform, for example, but they were the great. That was the great reforming ministry, and this is what people forget about him. He is a man who knows how to get things done.
But what actually practically was it more than Andrew Adonis and Tony Blair started? So the Free Schools programme really was an extension of the academies, wasn't it?
I mean, I think there was certainly a philosophical continuity, but they not only rammed it into overdrive. There was all the work on the curriculum. There was a whole host of reforms around teacher training. There was. It wasn't
reformed
just
GCSEs, but Dominic Cummings told me afterwards that he thought they should have scrapped them. So it was sort of, in a way, some of the reforms were.
Yeah, but no one ever gets in government. No one ever gets 100% of what they want. I mean, that said, I have huge respect for Dominic Cummings, and I think I'm utterly fascinated to see what he does. I do think we are making the classic mistake of in the way that people did with Hilton, in the way that people did with Nick Timothy, and in the way that people did with Alistair Campbell. That we always focus on the Svengali figures. It is ultimately Boris Johnson's government.
That's such a good point.
And the fact that he is the man in charge. He is the one setting the direction. The reason that Dominic Cummings has power is because Boris Johnson has given him power and has said, look, these are my objectives and I want you to accomplish them.
I suppose what I'm wondering is how far do you think Boris Johnson will go down the road that Dominic Cummings would like to go down, which will include a lot of crashing furniture, and how much will he pull back from that? Maybe Dominic Cummings not be still in office by the end of the year.
I mean, in Dom's own blog post, he says, look, I want to make myself obsolete. I want to, create systems so that in 2 years' time, I can step back and things will be self-perpetuating. That said, he was talking before the election that I'm going to stay here till we get Brexit done. I think once you've got that job, it's a really good job to have. You will have seen far more than me over the years. It is a tremendously wearing and grueling environment to be in. There is a some people can last a base, but Downing Street life has a tendency to burn to sort of. To chew people up a bit. So I mean, I think if he's in that position, he's going to sort of stay there for as long as he can, because it's the chance. He's been thinking about what he wants to do and what this country needs for so long. This is now his chance to actually do that.
One of the reasons people do look at Dominic Cummings is because they're not quite sure what Boris Johnson stands for himself, and they think, well, Dominic Cummings is going to hand it to him on a coat hanger and he's going to wear the suit. What is this new project, the People's Government? Is it Blairism of the right, a British kind of Peronism or something like that? What will take shape, and will it really be that different from the Tory administrations we've known in the past?
I think what's very interesting is he has hired a man who is in favour of creative destruction. So there is an intention, I think, to be radical, and that's partly to do with Brexit and getting that through, enforcing that through, and taking on the old establishments in Brussels. But at the same time, there is something quite traditional about the public spending plans. It isn't a kind of old-fashioned right-wing, small state, Thatcherite, free marketeer conservatism. If anything, that's a more sort of traditionally Labourite, statist approach. And what I think is fascinating is Boris Johnson this week is trying to position himself as a change government, a whole new government, a revolution. It was, he echoed Blair in that first day by saying a new dawn is broken, has it not? Virtually the same words as Blair. But actually, the Tories have been in power for 9 years. He's been in cabinet for a lot of that. So when Sajid Javid is going around saying, you've got to look at all the white elephants that we can scrap and look for, strangling kittens at birth, whatever it was, the pet project.
Still strong controls on current spending, Sajid Javid saying.
Yes, yeah, and also that a lot of those pet projects are things that Conservative ministers and people sitting around the cabinet table now actually started. So there is a sense of how revolutionary can it be when there's also continuity?
So my answer to this, and it's actually now one that Boris himself has used. He's Michael Heseltine plus Brexit.
Can you be that?
One of the things which baffles me is this attempt by many on the left and many Remainers to say that Boris is some sort of this is a far right government, is extremist, all the rest of it. Boris's policy platform when he stood for leader was incredibly centrist, incredibly mainstream, incredibly, the one nation is the phrase they use. The manifesto that was incredibly, let's spend more on the NHS, more police, more education funding. We're going to invest in infrastructure. We're going to spread the wealth to the north. As you said, this is not Thatcher 2.0. So his instincts are to. Is that he wants a government which sort of reflects the will of the people. I think speaks to and works for the people. I think the issue is that his definition of the people is slightly different from the definition of the people that people have in Westminster. I.e., it's not the people who go to Westminster dinner parties. It's the people who 52% of the country voted for Brexit. That's not an extreme position.
But the thing is, when it comes to just take Brexit, when it comes to the negotiations about the future relationship, does he want regulations, workers' rights, consumer rights to be the same as the EU ones, which is going to protect the people in the factory in Sunderland and the other red wall places? Or does he want to go for this kind of Singapore-on-Thames, low regulation, low tax economy, which would mean diverging from the EU, but potentially getting a trade deal with the US? And I think there is a sort of conflict, internal conflict there.
I think so. I mean, I'd say, I think the instincts are towards divergence.
So that then means fewer workers' rights, lower tax, etc., doesn't it, or not?
So the instincts are towards divergence, because what is the point of leaving the EU if you're just going to do everything in the same way that we've done in the EU? But that said, there will obviously be areas where it makes more sense to converge, where it's not worth the candle.
But is it going to diverge towards the US, which means having lower regulation?
But one of the weird things about the British political debate on the NHS on this is that we seem to imagine that the US is the only political model in the world. I mean, we said on workers' rights, they've said again and again and again that they are going to keep workers' rights. They just want to legislate for that on a UK basis rather than just sort of signing up to EU rules. Environmental protections, animal welfare. There are all these areas where.
Surely, if you want to get a trade deal with the US, or lots of other countries, you're going to have to agree to diverge from regulations on workers' rights. This sort of chlorinated chicken argument.
But chlorinated chicken isn't workers' rights. That's food.
No, environmental rights. I said.
Animal welfare. Yeah, I mean, I think there's going to be a fascinating process of working out, people within government working out what their priorities are and where they want to go. But
it goes to the heart of that question: can you be a Heseltine Brexiteer? And we really don't know the direction of travel. One of the things I wondered was at the end of this administration, whether it's 5 years, 10 years, will we look back and say, actually, it was all about taking back control, but not necessarily using it as wildly as we might have expected, or will we have diverged? That's what do you think is the answer to that?
I think quite a lot of I think quite a lot of this is about the future rather than the present. I mean, and I think this is probably more of a Cummings than a Johnson thing. Although I think it reflects Boris's own thoughts as well. Is this idea is about the industries of the future, about the really strong emphasis on science, on research, on AI, life sciences. There's a clean energy is a huge part of the thing. It's about positioning Britain to be a hotbed of science and research and enterprise and growth.
And slip the surly bonds of European regulation, which people like Dominic Cummings feel are particularly constraining and slow and sclerotic and don't move fast enough to allow you to take advantage of new technology.
Yes, yeah, I think that would. I think that's right.
And when we look back, that could be the area where we really did take back control and diverge. You think?
Yeah, and again, there are trade-offs and debates. For example, does the UK develop its own data regime, or do we accept that the GDPR is here and that our companies are already using it? There are lots of these financial services. It's really interesting that everyone from Mark Carney to George Osborne is saying, look, we are the financial services capital of Europe. It really does not make sense for us to obey rules which are written in Brussels, although that will inevitably have an impact on our access to markets. So there are all these areas where we're going to have all these these actually really quite interesting discussions.
And that could have a massive impact depending on whether it goes well or not. But in terms of the day-to-day stuff that people encounter, your guess is that when it comes to environmental controls, labour laws, what sort of product standards we make things to, actually, at the end of even if it was 10 years of Boris Johnson, things might be quite the same.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the uses of free trade deals, obviously, is to allow people to have cheaper stuff. So that's so hopefully if they're negotiating these deals, that's one of the things they'll have in mind. But fundamentally, I keep coming back to this point. Tories want to win elections. Like the idea that the Tories are going to privatise the NHS and sell it off to Donald Trump. What even if they did want to do that, they're not insane. The sort of the implicit promise made to people in these in the red wall areas, but not just in the north, but in communities across the country, even places like Watford, for example. The implicit promise is we are going to fix the things that annoy you, and we are going to make your life better.
The problem is, can you get the benefits of Brexit without removing some of those regulatory, either whether you see it as protections or burdens? And what happens in the transition period? So it's all very well saying we're going to have this fantastic AI, science, biotechnology, or whatever, but those are the industries of the future. What about the industries that are here now, which are giving people actual jobs now? Whether it's the car industry is probably the most obvious example. What happens to the people whose jobs are going to be affected by the supply chain if we haven't got a close relationship with the EU? How do you deal with those trade-offs without harming the people? How do you get the benefits of Brexit without harming the people in the areas you need to vote for you?
Well, I think that's going to be that's going to be a process of negotiation. But I think the aim certainly is for that to be a process of negotiation and for that to be a process of discussion, rather than this all-consuming, all-conquering, all embracing, thing which just swallows the news agenda, swallows the government's time, prevents them from getting anything done. I think these are really interesting and important questions, but fundamentally, they're not the totality of what the government is doing. They're not there's vast swathes of people's lives and vast swathes of things they care about which have nothing to do with Brexit. And one of the get Brexit done. Well, the reason that resonated so much was because people were like, there's lots of other things we want government to focus on.
Mm.
We've had a sort of foreign policy shock to start the new year with the killing by America of Iran's top general in Iraq. Did we learn anything about direction of travel that Boris Johnson's going to take, or is it by watching his handling of that, albeit that he was invisible for the first few days of the new year, but from what his government is doing, have we learned anything, or are we still at the foothills of knowing what direction he's going to take?
I thought that was really interesting, actually, it fits in with this discussion we're having, because there was this trade-off between America and Europe, even there. So to what extent was he going to endorse what Trump had done? And he was trying very carefully, I thought, in Prime Minister's question time, to balance those two things. So he did say, that Soleimani had the blood of British troops on his hands, but he still also emphasised the importance of European collaboration, and that was his main political argument, and he's being quite careful, I think.
He can walk that line at the moment.
At the moment, but what if he was lucky in a way it didn't escalate? Because what if Trump had said, we want you to send a couple of British planes to help with some airstrikes? What if it comes to that? What would he do? And I think there will come a crunch point, and the trade talks put an extra dimension onto that, make it trickier.
Robert?
Well, I think again it sort of illustrates this point that he's not the British Trump. He is his reaction was essentially the same as any sensible British Prime Ministers would have been, which is to say, look, we understand why you did this. We are your loyal allies. At the same time, our position on Iran is slightly different. It's effectively the classic thing of trying to be a bridge between America and Europe.
Brexit hasn't changed that much.
I think they took the right course, but apart from Jeremy Corbyn, there's no Prime Minister you can sort of imagine in recent history doing anything much different. It's the classic British position.
But that's two areas where you've suggested two of the main areas. You've suggested, if I read it correctly, that Brexit won't actually change things radically.
Well, I think Brexit will. I was just having. So we're doing a big conference on trade in March. So I've been thinking quite a lot about this. We do have this sort of these fascinating opportunities and this fascinating discussion we're going to have about what country are we? What are we for? What are we for? Like where are we turning in the world? What are,
in the election campaign much? Did it?
But obviously we want to have a close relationship with Europe economically, and have seamless and frictionless trade with Europe. At the same time, Europe is not growing. Europe is shrinking as a percentage of the fastest growing parts of the world are elsewhere, and we don't have the ties with them that we would want to, or that we arguably should have. And some countries like Germany manages to export perfectly well within the EU, obviously, but the Brexit it's an opportunity to just sort of think, and are we going to be taking a lead as a champion of free trade around the world? Are we going to be trying to set our own standards? Are we going to be getting other countries to weigh in with us? How do you balance? America, China, India. How do you balance these? These are like really interesting questions.
What does he have a mandate for out of that election? Because that wasn't really the governing debate of that election, was it?
No, I don't think it ever would be. Elections are generally.
They're boiled down a bit more than that.
Yeah, boiled down a bit more than that. And but this is, but it's something that's implicit in Brexit. It's not a sort of crazy. It's not a sort of crazy ideological thing. It's like we are leaving the European Union. So what happens next? That's and it's not something where Number 10 are saying this is what is going to happen. It's something. I think it's a much more organic thing, which will emerge from debate, from decisions made by our companies, decisions made by our government. It's really a really sort of fascinating thing.
What I find really interesting is Boris Johnson is peculiarly absent in a weird way. The fact he didn't say anything on the Iran situation for several days. He was on his sunbed in Mystique. I thought was a mistake, but was also slightly odd. And on these big political debates, he loves the sort of great man theory of politics. He wants to be a sort of Churchill figure. In his biography of Churchill, he talks about one man can make a difference, character is destiny, all that kind of thing. But yet, at the same time, he's strangely unwilling to lead and say exactly what he thinks, where he wants to go, what direction he wants to take the country in. I think as a result, that's why he does end up with someone like Dominic Cummings seeming like a very influential character. It'd be really interesting what happens with this big reshuffle we're expecting in February, whether that gives a real sense of direction.
I think that's slightly unfair. We had the election, in December the 12th. Then we had Christmas. He went on holiday. We were in the very early stages.
But we can't. You helped write the manifesto, and you can't really say what he wants the future relationship with the EU to be. I find that quite surprising.
I think the section on the manifesto is really clear on that. I should say
but we
I
can't answer these questions of the trade-offs, which are crucial.
It is essentially the relationship which should be as close as possible, but there will be no political alignment with the EU. We're not going to be subsumed.
Isn't the point? The point is regulatory alignment, isn't it? I just find it really interesting that he thinks of this politics as a great man theory, but actually he sort of absents himself from the stage quite often when it really matters.
And there does seem to be a genuine idea in Number 10 that it's quite good to hold the leader back a bit and not have them out there.
So you had Ben Wallace going out to answer the first questions on Iran.
That might be a good way of stopping fatigue.
Well, this is actually sorry to plug, but I wrote a book about how technology is speeding up the pace of life, and one of the chapters I wrote on was about the impact on the media agenda. So this is actually completely separate for Brexit. Essentially, every government sort of is in this it goes through this process of working out how to engage with this incredibly fast-paced and a sort of all-consuming media agenda. And do you basically try to interject yourself into the rolling news, into the Twitter stream? Do you try to sort of surf the waves? Do you step back from it and say, actually, no, we're going to make fewer, more strategic interventions, which so the May team, for example, came in and were like they basically pulled back almost completely from
store up the political capital for
but then the result of that was that the agenda was filled with the news and was filled with people being rude about the Prime Minister.
And we have previous Prime Ministers commenting on even caste changes in Coronation Street.
Exactly, yeah. So everyone is sort of in negotiation with the regime before them and trying to avoid the missteps made by the previous regime, so I think they're, but equally, I do think we're at too early a stage now to be coming up with a grand theory of Boris Johnson's media strategy, if you see what I mean.
It's not really a media strategy. It's the Iran crisis was an Iran crisis. It was a situation, his first international crisis as Prime Minister, and he was in Mystique.
But equally,
it's not a media Twitter space.
We are a big and important nation. I'm not entirely sure what, even the most resounding statement by a British Prime Minister from his sunbed would have added to. The British government made its position clear, but ultimately this was about America and Iran, and the rest of us were all sort of standing on the sidelines while that happened.
Who do you think Boris Johnson would most fear winning the Labour leadership contest, Rachel?
I think it's a really interesting question. I suspect the one who would unsettle him most is Jess Phillips, because she'd sort of throw a rock into the pond and you'd never quite know where the ripples would end up and how the waves would lap against him. I think the one he would favour would be Rebecca Long-Bailey, because she is so, if somebody gives Corbyn 10 out of 10, that is so not, as Rob said at the beginning, it's not realising the scale of the problem Labour faces.
Yeah, it's this weird thing where everyone's used the line already, but she is not even the best leader in her own flat. Angela Rayner is so clearly a more convincing potential leader of the Labour Party. I was sort of interested by Lisa Nandy, because I think she's built her entire. If the Tories are about those northern towns and about those working class, middle class voters, they're just about managings. Those are the people. She is very, very much focused on those people. She's helped set up the Centre for Towns, for example. But equally, I think given the current composition of the Labour Party, it's very hard to see. She apparently had a very impressive performance at Hustings, but it's kind of quite hard to see how she comes through the middle.
Is it telling that in the first gander around the course we haven't mentioned Keir Starmer?
I think he'd be able to hold Boris Johnson to account on the technical details of Brexit, which is actually quite an important job this year.
Boris Johnson intends not to discuss much.
Well, but he will have to in the House of Commons, even though he's reduced the role of Parliament. He will have to answer questions on it. So he would be able to hold him to account on that, which I think, and scrutinise the detail, which I think will be important. But I think there isn't that. I think somebody like Jess Phillips has a sort of character which cuts through, perhaps, in a way that Boris Johnson does, and is in a slightly more modern way.
But I think, generally, I'm not sure Boris has reduced the role of Parliament. I think the election result has reduced the role of Parliament. I think we're still covering.
He has stopped MPs having a vote to give a negotiating mandate, hasn't he?
Yeah, but
your argument is he would have won it anyway.
He would have won it anyway. But I think what we're unprepared for, and what the Labour Party is unprepared for, is effectively what happens after the leadership contest is over. Because we're not used to having it's been 2014. Scottish independence referendum. Since then, every single year has been convulsed and chaotic and crazy. It's been a very long time since we had a normal government with a decent working majority. And I think what people sort of aren't taking into account is how the conversation changes. I remember the Blair Brown years, when everything was about Blair and Brown. Rachel, you were the high priestess of the Blair Brown wars.
TBGBs.
Yeah, the TBGBs. Mm-hmm. Every week in the Telegraph and then later the Times. Your columns would be like this. Basically. Tony said this about Gordon, and Gordon said this about Tony, because that was what the news agenda was.
They called it tittle tattle, and then wrote about it in their memoirs.
Yeah, and I think so. in that environment, what happened for the media? And I'm saying this as a former journalist rather than in my sort of think tank role. What happens within government becomes the focus and becomes much more important than what happens in Parliament. I mean, I remember talking to someone about this. The sort of classic sort of column template. You'd write sort of 700 words on what was happening with Labour. You'd throw in a 300 words on and meanwhile the Tories, and then like a final two, and what of the Lib Dems? Just they got like a paragraph at the end. That was the sort of rough balance of attention.
If you were guessing how history will look back at the Boris Johnson administration, where do you think the tensions will be? Exactly to the area you were just talking about there, Robert. Will they be over, should we really spend this much? Because so many Tories' instincts are not to splash around state cash. Will they be around the shape of the relationship with Europe? Will they be over something else, like the Union? You talked about Scottish independence there. What if you were guessing now, the crystal ball is out?
I mean, I think any president, politician, prime minister, if what they thought was going to define their government always ends up sort of not being. I mean, if you'd asked David Cameron before 2008 what his government would look like, then he'd have said, given you one answer. Then he'd have said, it's going to be all about austerity, and actually then it became all about Europe. He was going to be the guy who stopped us banging on about Europe. Blair likewise. It started with we're going to make Britain a modern nation and transform it. Ended up with war in Iraq. Events do have a habit of.
I think that Europe issue will quite quickly become a problem though in government, because if he wants to get a deal this year, Boris Johnson is going to have to make some pretty big concessions to the EU and align quite closely with EU rules and regulations. Otherwise, the timetable just doesn't work, as been made clear this week. So if he wants to avoid crashing out without a deal, which I think he will want to, I don't know what Rob thinks, he'll have to make some pretty big concessions, and that is going to really annoy the Eurosceptics.
The alternative, well, I think there's two sort of. I mean, they've been very clear that they don't want an extension. I mean, the manifesto says it, but they've said it again and again and again.
They've legislated.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I think there's two answers. So either there is one big all-encompassing deal, or and I saw this floated today, that you end up with a series of mini deals and sector deals, so that you have sort of a deal on aviation, a deal on goods, a deal on fisheries, and obviously these all sort of tie in and reinforce each other, but it's not. It's sort of it allows you to get the essentials done and then sort of do the rest of it.
Isn't that quite hard though? Because doesn't one deal play off against another deal? No, in the end, it's always a case of balances and compromises.
Yeah. But going back to the original question about what I think the tensions will be, I think obviously, I think that there is there will inevitably be a tension between new and old Toryism. Delivering for these new voters, and while still retaining fiscal discipline. But Boris is, he's always said there's a symmetry. Yes, he wants to spend more on the public services, but you can only do this by supporting wealth creation, by supporting innovation. And I was struck by some polling on what people think is the best way to help the regions is to create more businesses in those regions. Voters understand that businesses are where the growth comes from.
So I suppose what I was getting at there was just exactly bring it back to our original point. At the end of 5, maybe 10 years, will it feel like we've been through a revolution, or will it actually feel like we've had another Tory Prime Minister for 2 terms of a kind that we can very, very much recognise as in the pattern of Tory Prime Ministers?
I think we're all going to find out. I think part of that again.
The case, it's open book. You're not quite sure either way.
I think if Dominic Cummings stays around for the duration, then there's going to be all sorts of really interesting things that happen. But quite a lot of this is about fundamentally, and Rachel Wolfe, who was who wrote the manifesto and is really brilliant, and her husband James Frayne, who came up with the Just About Managing. So, it's sort of revolution in the service of some very, I'm not going to say sort of humdrum, but very, very ordinary ends. Very, it's
revolutionary
about,
methods, perhaps.
The reason that Dominic Cummings wants to rip up the state is not, is to grow the economy, create more business, but also, to ensure that the NHS works better, delivers 50,000 more nurses, 50 million more GP appointments, fixes the potholes. These are, it's
like that line from The Leopard, everything must change so that everything can stay the same.
Yeah, I mean, I think,
I think I'm not sure, I think that's David Cameron's modernisation. I think Dominic Cummings is more everything must change so that everything must change. And I'm not sure which Boris Johnson is. I think he's a bit more everything must change so that everything must stay the same.
So he's
but I don't know. I mean, I think he blows with the wind.
Mop.
I think he blows with the wind a bit, and also I think he'll be forced when he's forced to make decisions, either by circumstances or by time or by events or by political realities. He's going to be forced into positions that he may not even know he's got. So, for example, what does he govern on behalf of the people in Workington or Woking? It's that, and there will sometimes be a clash. I noticed there was one of the new MPs for Bishop Auckland, I think, immediately got money for a new hospital this week in Prime Minister's Question Time. So how many other MPs are then going to get that immediately? And it's just the compromises are going to have to come somewhere.
Well, I mean, as we fundamentally, we're still in the Liam Byrne era of there is no money left. The taxes are at a really very high level as a percentage of GDP. We still, we don't want to reopen the deficit. I think the argument has shifted in terms of capital investment and infrastructure investment, and making the kind of investments that will, especially given borrowing costs, which will generate more productivity and growth in the long term and help these areas which haven't had their fair share of investment. But but fundamentally, we're not. I think. We'll see what happens at the spending review. There will probably be more money, but we're not going to go back towards the Blair years when spending was just going up by leaps and bounds, and there's so much money was being thrown at the public services that they couldn't even work out how to use it properly, because they're just we're in unless we can get growth rates back up to 3%, 4%, 5%. We're not going to have there's going to be some tough calls to be made.
Thank you very much indeed, both of you, for your time. Really appreciate it. Thanks so much.